The Philistine army gathered in overwhelming numbers, their weapons gleaming in the early light, ready to crush Israel beneath their might. The air was thick with tension, every soldier bracing for the coming storm. Across the field, the Israelites stood paralyzed by fear, their hearts pounding as they faced a seemingly unstoppable enemy. King Saul, once a mighty leader, was now gripped by terror and deep regret, his confidence shattered. Saul, once chosen by God to lead his people, now felt utterly abandoned, his past disobedience and mistakes haunting his every thought, leaving him isolated and desperate. Meanwhile, David, the hero who had once slain Goliath and inspired a nation, was now living among the Philistines, trusted by their king, Achish, and forced to hide his true allegiance. Achish, believing David to be loyal, ordered him to join the battle against Israel, placing David in an impossible position, torn between his people and his own survival. Saul, desperate for guidance and answers, sought help from God, but found only silence and darkness, his pleas echoing unanswered in the night. David, caught between loyalty and survival, faced a test that would define not only his future, but the fate of a nation. Every decision weighed heavily on his conscience. The fate of both men hung in the balance, as war loomed on the horizon and destinies collided in the shadow of conflict. This was a crossroads, one man paralyzed by fear and regret, the other trapped by circumstance and impossible choices, as the world around them prepared for battle. Saul's desperation grew as God remained silent, his heart heavy with fear and uncertainty. The weight of his failures pressed down on him, and every moment of silence from above only deepened his dread. Dreams, sacred rituals, and the wisdom of prophets, none brought answers. Saul tried every holy tradition, but the heavens remained closed, leaving him more isolated than ever. In panic and utter hopelessness, Saul broke his own law and sought out a forbidden medium in Endor, risking everything for a glimmer of guidance. Disguised and trembling, he begged her to summon the prophet Samuel's spirit, desperate for any word from the world beyond. The medium, terrified by what she was asked to do, complied, and Samuel appeared, his gaze heavy with sorrow and the weight of prophecy. Samuel asked, "Why have you disturbed me?" His voice echoed with both sadness and warning. Saul confessed his fear, his overwhelming isolation, and the pain of God's silence. He admitted he no longer knew where to turn. Samuel's reply was devastating. "You disobeyed God. The kingdom is torn from you and given to David." Saul's worst fears were confirmed. He warned, "Tomorrow, you and your sons will die. Israel will fall to the Philistines." The prophecy was final, and Saul's fate was sealed. Saul collapsed, crushed by despair and the certainty of his fate. The burden of his choices became unbearable. Saul's final plea brought no hope, only the echo of his own failures, reverberating in the empty halls of his memory. The king who once stood tall now faced his end, utterly alone, abandoned by God and man alike. His tragic path was set, and the shadow of his downfall stretched before him, unchangeable and absolute. As Saul faced doom, David prepared to march with the Philistines against his own people. The Philistine commanders, suspicious of David's loyalty, demanded his removal from the battle. Achish, though disappointed, obeyed and sent David away. David was spared from fighting Israel, not by his own hand, but by God's unseen intervention. What seemed like rejection was actually protection. David and his men turned back, unaware of the crisis awaiting them at home. God's providence redirected David, saving him from a choice that could have destroyed his future. The path ahead would test him in new ways. David's story was far from over. Sometimes, deliverance comes disguised as disappointment. David returned to Ziklag only to find his home in ruins, the city smoldering and lifeless after a devastating attack. His family, along with the families of all his men, had been taken captive by the ruthless Amalekites. The grief was overwhelming, and sorrow filled the air as the men realized the depth of their loss. In their anguish, the men turned on David, blaming him for their tragedy and even speaking of stoning him in their despair. Alone, broken, and facing the anger of his own people, David sought solace and strength in God, pouring out his heart in desperate prayer. He asked for guidance, pleading, "Should I pursue the raiders? Is there hope for rescue?" God answered with clarity and assurance, "Pursue them. You will surely overtake them and succeed in the rescue." Renewed with faith and determination, David rallied his men and set out in relentless pursuit of the enemy. Along the way, they found an abandoned slave, who, after being cared for, guided them directly to the Amalekite camp. David's men launched a surprise attack, defeating the Amalekites, rescuing every captive, and recovering all their stolen possessions. Miraculously, not a single person was lost. Every loved one was brought home safely. David then shared the spoils of victory equally among his men, honoring both those who fought and those who, exhausted, had stayed behind to guard the supplies. He also sent gifts to the elders of Judah, building unity, gratitude, and goodwill among his people. In the midst of crisis, David found his strength in God, and through faith and courage, turned disaster into a remarkable victory. His unwavering leadership and deep faith set him apart as a true leader of his people. Out of the ashes of despair, hope and restoration were born for David and his people. On Mount Gilboa, the Philistines crushed Israel just as Samuel had foretold. Saul's sons, including Jonathan, fell in battle. Saul, wounded and desperate, asked his armor-bearer to end his life, but the man refused. Saul fell on his own sword, ending his tragic reign. His armor-bearer followed, dying beside him. The Philistines desecrated their bodies, displaying them as trophies. Yet, the men of Jabesh-Gilead risked everything to recover and bury Saul and his sons with honor. Saul's life ended in darkness, but a final act of loyalty brought a glimmer of dignity. Even in tragedy, courage and kindness endure. The shadow of Saul's fall would shape Israel's future and David's rise.